Thank you, Simon. Yes, the podcast is actually called The Adelaide Show, but I saw some people frantically searching their podcast apps, and I don't want disappointment in the audience yet. So let me introduce you to, to our panellists that we have here today. I'll start on my left. I have Shannon Baldock, Refrigeration and Electrical Lecturer at TAFE SA. Rachelle Boyle, Event Planning Coordinator, Adelaide Convention Centre, and a former TAFE student. We also have Tom Cleghorn, Manager Workforce Development, Resthaven, and Anthony Kittel, CEO of Redarc Electronics. I thought to get things underway, I remember, not personally, but hearing that Socrates said 2,500 years ago that the beginning of wisdom is the definition of terms. So I'd like to whip through the panel and just get, off the cuff, what lifelong learning means to you. Anthony, I'll start at the other end.
I think lifelong learning consists probably of three things. I'd say there's formal, informal and practical learning that happens throughout your whole life. And embracing each of those elements so that you can become or reach your potential.
Thank you. Tom?
For me, following interests, my interests have evolved over a number of years, and I guess the important thing is transferable skills that you take with you. Stopping or following a different interest doesn't mean that you leave everything else behind. In fact, it's a combination effect, and everything is applicable.
Okay. Rachelle?
Yeah, I think it's having the opportunity to upskill and reskill and continue to learn throughout your life, and follow different interests, but ultimately build on, your skills as they are.
And look, from my point of view, I see lifelong learning as in the context of qualifications, not seeing a qualification as an end, seeing that as the start. What next? That's what we try and instill in students. What can I do now? The next step. It's not seeing that as that's it. I don't have to learn anymore.
Well, you've all read my notes. Let's start formally now. There were some interviews done with some young early school leavers about their experience in VET, with the young people explaining how the more adult-focused learning environment was something they liked. There was a quote in this research that stood out to me. They treat you maturely here like how you should be treated in the real world. In high school, people look at you and go, you're just a student and you should adhere to the rules and you have to stay in between these lines, being held down and looked at as a little kid. Rachelle, can I ask, how old were you when you were at TAFE, and what do you recall of the learning environment?
I was 18 when I started going to TAFE. It's an adult learning environment. They do treat you like an adult, which means that you are in charge of your own learning, and you basically set your own direction in terms of what you're going to achieve. How much effort you put in is up to you. So I really enjoyed my time there, and I got a lot of opportunities out of it because I, pushed myself, and I took every opportunity to intern and to volunteer above and beyond just completing my assignments and being done with it. Yeah.
Was that driven nature shared by all your cohorts?
No.
Shannon, you must see this, bird's eye view.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a different relationship to your school-based role. I see it more of a peer-to-peer way of teaching. I think you have to respect the students. I mean, part of the way adult educators learn, they don't respect you. If they don't respect what you're teaching, they just won't. Well, you are not God to the students, as is sort of the traditional with these sort of traditional schools. If they think you're full of crap, they just won't listen. So you have to form that peer relationship, and you have to bring them along. You can't force it down their throats and just accept them to learn it.
Wow. You've also defined my parenting model too. Shannon, I'm going to stay with you just at the moment though, because while we're thinking about younger people entering the vet system, we know that many of them leave the secondary education system disengaged. What's being done, or what can be done within the vet system to re-engender some degree of engagement?
I think a lot of what we see for our students is, and the fact that we work very closely with industry with a lot of our training with the likes of Redarc, they see that this is meaningful education. It has an outcome. It is leading to a job, or it's leading on to further study. It is not, you can't have students in vet who are wondering why they are learning this. You have to bring them along. You have to have them to understand this is very much related to this role in the workforce. And if you give them that respect, then we find that that transition is a lot easier. We do get quite a few students who come out, like you've said, disengaged. And when we show them that this is not just learning for learning's sake, we get far better engagement with the students. So, and also a lot of our lecturing staff have also had their own apprentices, their own employees, so they have done peer-to-peer learning in a workplace, which is transferable into the training environment.
I'm going to turn to the Alpha Beta's Future Skills report now, because they predicted that Australians are going to need to invest greater time in formal learning in the future, especially individuals considered to be mid-career. The pressure to upskill, though, means pressure to find time to fit that training in and around work. Anthony, I'm going to turn to you for this one, because you've embraced this lifelong learning model at Redarc. There must be a cost to this with disruption, especially when your better and most crucial people are off training, etc. How are you managing, and is this extra effort paying off?
Yeah, effectively, if someone's studying outside of work, then or during work time, it's probably around about at least 10 to 20% of their time. And so the only way really to cover that is to employ more people, so that you can be flexible to allow those people to go out and do their training. And the way we approach it is that our survival depends on having the most highly skilled workforce. And what I mean by that is we're not competing in South Australia or Australia, we're competing globally. So there's this intense pressure, this disruption and new technologies coming out that mean if our people aren't being trained, then we're not able to embrace that technology or embrace those disruptive forces. So it's something that, it's like any other budget line item in your P&L, it's an essential. And when times get tough, don't cut training. When times get tough, don't cut marketing, because they're the first things normally you go to and cut. But we're in a global game, and it's critical to Redarc's success in 3 to 5 years' time.
You're painting the picture of someone who doesn't have much choice other than to...
Absolutely. The forces of disruption generally I find is about 18 months. So if your company's not developing its people in that 18-month period, you get left behind.
Tom, at Resthaven, are you in this sort of situation? Because I do pick up from some of my discussions with people in the vet sector that in your sector, some of this disruption from technology is not as acute.
Yeah, so we, from a continuous learning point of view, we've actually just, I was just speaking with Anthony about, we've just in the last week, we've begun 30 existing staff through traineeships, and that's funded through the government, and that's acknowledging the aged care sector is going through a Royal Commission, and one of those things that might come out of that are a minimum level of qualification. So part of it is anticipating what might come, but also the point of we're not just looking at people getting a certificate in order to move into a role within the business. It's actually acknowledging the staff that we have and preparing them for future responsibilities. So we have reasonably high attrition, and one of those things that happens is people get put into situations they're not comfortable in. So education is part of that as well. So it's actually preparing people for future tasks, making them feel comfortable and confident. As far as moving into the platforms in which we educate, that's certainly something that I'm grappling with. So I spent a number of years working in mining and then tourism and now aged care. Believe it or not, they're quite similar from my role and how we educate, but I think certainly the move around online learning and how that's delivered, focus for my team is to use online learning to free up my team to make sure they're actually doing meaningful engagements with staff. So actually coaching them, feeling like they've got someone working alongside them, supporting them, as opposed to someone standing up in front of them, assessing. And that's kind of a barrier that we're trying to break. So the team are working with people and feeling like they've got a peer as opposed to someone who's actually judging.
I've actually got some particular aged care questions to come back to you in just a moment. But for everyone here, I just want to pose this. If lifelong learning is taken between the teeth by most workers, the UK Institute of Directors, one of the things they see in it is it's the key to social mobility, upward mobility for workers. It means that people like you, Anthony, might not be able to rely on thinking we're going to stay with you as a loyal worker all our life because we'll be able to disappear and better ourselves. Does that cause some resistance in not wanting to open the gates to learning for your work?
I think it was Richard Branson who said better to train them and have them leave than not train them and have them stay.
Okay.
No more needs to be said.
Rachelle, can I just ask you, personally, I don't know how much you want to confess here. Are you likely to stay where you are for a long time, or are you moving on soon?
I think so. I think just having a workplace that's so supportive of learning and of improving, and like the uni course that I'm doing now is not necessarily related to event planning, but my employer is happy for me to continue to learn because I'll be a better employee the more knowledge I have. And so I think that does make me want to stay longer. Yeah.
Tom, I'm coming back to this aged care question now, because as it happens, your sector is going to have a dire need for about 69,000 trained people by 2023, if the figures I've seen are correct. I'm studying design thinking at RMIT at the moment, and one of my fellow students shared some of their research that I'm going to unethically share with everyone here now, because as part of her interview, she interviewed a carer in the sector, and there were two things I'd like you to comment on, and everyone. This carer who was interviewed has university-level education in their home country. And so, my fellow students opining, how do we affirm those skills that people, particularly in caring roles, have from either other sectors or other countries? And are we good at detecting that nuance and exploiting that asset? And the second part is the carer seems to bring considerable heart and empathy to her role and laments that she doesn't get to spend as much time with the people she's caring for as she wants to. And she noted that there doesn't seem to be any training in the emotional side of that particular job. Is that being addressed? Is it addressable? Well, there we go. Easy questions to bounce off.
Okay. Sure. Certainly, a lot of our workforce come from born overseas and do come with qualifications overseas. And I think there's definitely aged care being under Royal Commission and being heavily scrutinised. The challenge there is identifying and I guess defending in a way. You know, we are an industry that's very much compliance driven, and so that's the challenge for one thing. Something that I'm working on at the moment is a very basic capability framework, and that really looks at job descriptions, awards, and saying what's required at each level. And I think that's part of the way of acknowledging the skills that are brought in from other people. a lot of the emphasis is as well focused on learning new skills or identifying gaps as opposed to acknowledging what is known. And I think there's a risk in that, particularly we've just brought in a whole new set of industry standards, and the emphasis is on this big abstract set of standards, and we're transitioning to something new. A lot of what we do is aligned perfectly, and the emphasis hasn't been on that. So I think part of it is that. And that's also, I think, in assisting those that are coming in with degrees outside of the country, working with universities and training organisations to help recognise that. So I think as an organisation, it's more to do with the relationships we have with universities and RTOs to actually partner and assist with that. The second question.
Emotional side, the EQ, the soft
Yeah.
skills, I suppose.
So I didn't choose aged care. I selected it for the role, and I've found since being in this industry how important it is. So having my grandma, who was the first palliative care consultant in South Australia and worked her whole life for RDNS, and she died last year from dementia. And she went through a really long period of loss. So she lost Grandpa 15 years ago. A few years after that, she lost the keys to a car because dementia progressed. So she lost her autonomy with that. She was an avid gardener, but she had a house up near Resthaven and couldn't care for that on her own as well. So she went in independent living, and so she lost her husband, car, house. And so a lot of that was connected with her identity, right? Because she wasn't working, didn't have a partner, didn't have a house, she couldn't make decisions to go for a drive. It was when she went into St. Louis, just in the Thornton area, where she'd gone over this period of loss over so many years, and she went into this residential facility and she went back to being a nurse again. And I mean, partly because dementia had progressed, sometimes she knew she was actually a resident and sometimes she didn't, but it was actually quite a beautiful story because over those years of loss, she'd then gone in and it was the care staff that allowed that to happen. And so it's so important, the emotional side, the empathetic side of giving care. The emphasis, the education is very much centred on task-driven. And I think that was a really good example to see when someone had got their identity back. So certainly what we're focusing on is the stuff outside of the task, and it's so complex. And the expectation that we have on people delivering care. Yes, the task might be to assist someone showering, which no one wants to have someone help them shower, and that's the reality of it. But everything that sits outside of that task is what's complex and what's challenging, and certainly that's an area that we're focusing on. Yeah.
I'll use this, like touching on soft skills, to bring into employability skills, because, and I'm going to start with you on this one, Shannon, because you're currently teaching. The reports I look at say that employability skills like punctuality, communication are integral to a student's learning. Are we good at actually teaching those, or are they sort of taught accidentally whilst we're busy teaching other things?
Those skills are built into our units of competency, and we try and structure them into all of our learning that we do as close to workplace as you can. Being on time, being tidy, being respectful to your other workers, all of those sorts of things. We do some really quite intentional teaching on those things when we have students coming in through our foundation skills programs or through what we would call pre-vocational, and that's sort of particular to trades, but that's when there is a lot of CV writing, interacting with customers, lots of those sorts of things. We do get a lot of interest from employers who want those to be that lifelong learning, further study, so interacting with people, dispute resolution, those sorts of skills. But we do try and build it in. And look, if you make your training as close to what is happening as industry as you can, that is part of all of those skills must be present, or you are not competent in that task. So.
Sounds idealistic. Anthony, in the real world, when people roll up, are you finding potential workers have these employability skills, or are there some deficits?
Deficits. I think I'm a big fan of school-based apprenticeships because I think they help, whilst the student's being trained, they help build in that, I guess, the requirement of what a work life is looking for. And I'm talking the likes of, say, a Marsland Technical College or St Patrick's in that respect. Look, we're based in the southern suburbs, and we happily take students from school and train them. The biggest issue, I think, is, so communication is one, but I think resilience, mental health, these are the biggest issues by far that is prevalent in the workforce. And so we're finding that not only are we their coach, but we're their parent, we're their support, and when you're thinking about an employer, that you've got the cost of training, but then there's all these wraparound services that you need to add. That's just to get someone through their training program. We're not talking about their career, we're just talking about how can we get you from a student to a qualified trainee or apprentice.
Rachelle, did you feel totally ready when you finished your TAFE course and went into the workforce, or what gaps did you notice if there were some?
I don't think you can ever feel completely ready, but I was pretty confident. I was lucky that while I was at TAFE, I was doing internships and volunteering and being connected from, theoretical learning into actual being on site at a conference and all of that sort of thing. So I was pretty confident going in, and it really did not take me very long to sort of pick up anything else I needed to know, sort of dealing with customers and that kind of thing. You can't really learn. But, throughout, while I was at TAFE, we did topics where we'd have to do like a mock sales interview and all that kind of thing. So I did feel prepared for most of what I had, yeah.
All right. I'm just going to steer us a little bit towards this thing referred to as a learning evolution that is required. The World Economic Forum has called for this because they're saying employers are going to informal learning avenues to have greater flexibility to get what they need. And part of that is the feeling that some structured learning falls behind where we're at in the real world. How on earth can the vet sector have agility to craft courses that are abreast of all the changes coming at us at a rate of knots? Shannon, I'm going to start with you, if you don't mind.
So this comes back to the package question, doesn't it?
And also, actually, can I just have a footnote?
Yes.
When did you last update what you teach?
Updating it currently. In the process of updating it. That was a good question. I got that one. Hey.
You said your boss is up there.
Fine, he certainly is. I see. So there's a couple of things here, and I suppose it depends on what you're teaching from. There are some packages that we teach from that are more flexible than others in what you can teach and the way you can assess. Unfortunately, we teach under the electrotechnology package, which anyone here knows the electrotechnology package is a work in progress. And a lot of what we are trying to move to with some of these packages to make them less prescriptive. So we can, instead of having things like you must teach this particular appliance, we will teach what is industry relevant, and that's when we go back to our industry, back to our RERGs and our industry reference groups, find from them, what do you want us to teach? What is coming? What is the new thing? Well, you want us to teach this motor, it hasn't been used in 20 years. The package says we must still teach, but we are working through our industry reference groups to try and get that brought into the package so that we can make them more, it makes the packages more agile, but it is the nature of running into these packages and competency-based assessment that we must hit some of these things that are unfortunately not relevant. We do try and bring that into the way that we deliver, but there are some inherent issues with the fact that there are some things we need to teach that the packages can't change every 6 months when we have things that are changing so fast.
Anthony, how aligned are the offerings in the vet sector to what you need?
Look, they're pretty good. I think the key thing is that what we have to do for every student that's being trained in the vet sector, we have to have a mentor for them at work who's looking at the gap and building that bridge for them. So for instance, apprentices, we have a Friday afternoon session, and we'll have an engineer coach them on a Friday afternoon in work time. I think I give them an hour, so 3 till 4 is at our cost, and 4 till 5 is at their cost. So for 2 hours, they're getting top-up training on top of their training in the vet sector to make sure that we can build the bridge between vet and what's required on the job.
And is that mandatory?
That's not, no, it's voluntary. But of course, I'd go as far as saying that 60% of our students wouldn't pass their course without it, which is, and I'll defend TAFE. I'm not having a crack at TAFE because I'm a great fan of TAFE, but government has decimated the training system over the last few years. You can't get rid of all that skill base out of TAFE and expect that they can deliver the quality of service that they've delivered previously. So as an employer, the onus comes back to us to fix it when the student comes back to the job. It's a real shame.
Can I just follow up on that too? And the working with industry is the critical part. These training packages were not designed to be delivered completely standalone with no context in the workplace. And that partnership between industry and the training provider is really what makes this hum. So we see this when we have students that are possibly working in a very, very narrow part of the trade. If they are not getting that reinforcement in the workplace, which not all employers do, but some do, it is very difficult to backfill that just with training. So yeah, no, I mean what Redarc do is industry best practice is fantastic.
And I'll add to that is I think there's a lot of the issues come to primary school and then high school. How can a student at primary school who comes first, second or third in a running race not be recognised for that? Everyone wins. It's not like that in the real world. There is resilience and there is ups and downs in life, and the more we're going to a model like that, the more we're defeating what reality is. That's a personal view.
I'm just going to dodge around that one because I'll harken
But it's
back.
critical to the vet sector, because how can the vet sector make up for what the deficiency comes from school? You can't.
There's one more thing I'd like to cover before we open up for a few questions from the floor. I'm still dodging past it.
We all get an award today, don't we?
We do, yes. One of the barriers that people find between them and pursuing extra training is cost. And so there are different ways of dealing with this. I believe it's the Business Council of Australia has floated a notion, a little bit like the NDIS, where there would be what they call lifelong skills accounts, so that individuals can portfolio manage their learning over life. Singapore has the Skills Future Initiative, which is a one-off grant. Canada has just introduced a system, I believe, that you accrue credits towards, I think it's capped around $5,000. What do we think if we were given, Rachelle, I'll start with you. If you were given this $5,000 account to apply to ongoing training for you, does that excite you? Would you use it?
Yeah, absolutely. Learning is so important to me and I don't intend to ever stop. So that would be really great and a huge encouragement too, because it is a huge thing to take on extra learning when you are working. You know, I work full-time, I study full-time, but I do it because I love it and I do it because I know it's going to benefit me in the future, and it would definitely be a huge encouragement and a huge help to have that there. And I would encourage people who are probably hesitant as well.
Tom, look into your workers that you've got across Resthaven. Do you sense it would be a catalyst for many of them proactively taking up training?
Well, we offer that. So we offer a bit under $1,000 for every employer each year for professional development.
How much was that?
Just under $1,000.
Okay.
So it's not 5, but it is also each year. And it's an application process. So part of it is around preparing them for future roles, but also current. So very few of those get knocked back. So that's certainly encouraging it, and that comes through me. So I see a lot of those that come through. Yeah.
And Anthony, what do you think? Because at the moment, I'm imagining Redarc is footing the bill.
Yeah, look, we fund all of our employees' training, and we encourage people to take up training for whatever courses they'd like to take up. I think it's got merit. The only thing is it sounds a little bit like get a free laptop if you sign up to this course. So I think it's open to much abuse. But if it's managed properly, then I think it's a great idea.
Last question that I want to address before we open for a few, and that is, the figures show 1 in 10 Aussies are now self-employed. What's called the gig economy is growing. That's where you do project by project as an individual for different entities. If this continues to grow, it's quite a fractured system. Who takes responsibility for measuring competency, for assessing that and defining what is worthy? Is it the businesses who are the end customers, and so it's going to be itself fractured? What do you think of this future, Shannon?
Well, I mean, a lot of the reason people train at the moment is a requirement of their employer, or in our trade is to do with licensing. So when you remove that requirement, and when you're into a gig economy, and this is a bad example, but your employer is Uber, and if you are no longer working to what bar they set for your training, then I suppose that starts moving us into sort of the, I don't know, fractured sort of micro-credentials, but is it really leading to something? Or we have, I mean, this is something that in my own experience when I was working in IT, the training was done by the individual hardware makers, Canon, Epson, whoever. So you could leave as the world's most qualified Canon technician, but you are not an electronic technician.
Right.
So you are now very limited in what you can do with that, which is all great if you're going to continue in that part of the gig economy. But this is why I moved into started my electronics, because that was a path forward out of where I was.
There's a note here from Simon, don't mention Uber.
Don't mention Uber, problem. As from the government, any other ride sharing.
That's fine. Very quickly, then we'll take a question. Anthony, on this question of the gig economy, would you start making use of many subcontractors?
We have certainly started to increase our subcontractor use. I think it's either an Uber star system, you get 4.9 stars or wherever you're at. So it's the customer rating you, or it's the employer. Because if you're going to move from employer to employer, I'm sure there'll be a system developed where each employer ranks you, and they'll give you a star rating, and then the next employer understands.
Yes, and you can't game those systems at all, can you? No. Okay, I'm sure you've all been running gap analysis, and you probably have some deficits you'd like to amend with a question or two. Who's got a question? Oh, there's one. We have a microphone coming your way, and we've probably got time for one more after. Who's got the next best question here? Got some thinking time.
Hello, my name's Mike Stiles from the Southeastern Islands, otherwise known as New Zealand. You haven't addressed the elephant in the room when it comes to skilling for life, and I refer to the 40+% of the population that have literacy and or numeracy deficits and therefore risk being unengaged in this exciting new world, and I wonder whether you have any comments about that.
We at Redarc, we ran a program in conjunction with TAFE, specifically to address those issues. So any employee could nominate English, computer, literacy, numeracy, whatever was necessary to build up their skill credentials. But we do recognise it's a significant issue.
And I think this is where the Vet in Schools program really brings these forward when a lot of these issues are identified early on. I think something that we would like to work more with in our own work group is a lot of these people who have these LLN issues coming out of school already have individual education plans if they're at school in Australia, transitioning that across into the TAFE vet environment. That's normally a very, very valuable amount of information. We bring that into our work practice and then we know what we're working with. We can help and support where we need to.
Tom, in Resthaven's world?
Yeah, so we've We've certainly run projects over the years that focus on for people with English as a second language. That was a really relevant for a large portion of our workforce. Equally so, I think that there's an opportunity there for a different model for that group. I think there's still more that can be done. We have existing staff that are still challenged, and the solution for that, I think, is yet to be created.
Another question? Yep, there's, yeah, thank you. And there was another person over on this side who put their hand up. No?
This is just a follow-up to that question. I was in a session earlier. Is this on? Yeah. I was in a session earlier, and a woman from New Zealand said that having the TAFE teachers or the VET teachers undertake LLN training themselves was a game changer in New Zealand. So you combined the technical trade expertise with special techniques for actually teaching language and literacy and numeracy. I was wondering if that person's here or somebody else from New Zealand could talk about that.
If not, I'll take that as a comment. Always wanted to say that. Shannon, would you embrace that sort of?
Yeah, look, I think that's really important. And this is a strength of the VET system, is that the guy or girl standing up the front of the class has gone through the exact same training that you have. They've been there and done it. I find that one of the ways that I engage with my students on a personal level is the fact that I struggled like crap at school, and I get it. And I think when we have students that, especially when you're no longer having that your teacher up on a plinth, that can be a really, really strong way to engage with those students that have those learning difficulties. They understand, it's like, I've been through the same thing. You still need the supports around. There is only so much you can do with that. But when you're in an environment when the person standing up the front may have had the same struggles that you did learning this material, I think that's a really powerful thing to use.
And I thought there was another question on this side somewhere. Did I see a hand before? Or am I imagining things? Would someone just make a question up on that side for me? No? Any last question? We've got time for one more question. There must be one in this body of learned people. There we are. Just thank you. Just 1 second. Here we go.
I'd like to ask about the mantra that all students, that VET has to prepare students to be work ready for the first day. Now, we know that no one's ready on the first day. So would anybody like to comment on how we can change this thing that everybody seems to repeat? Oh, we're wanting to have our students ready for the first day.
I will pick someone if no one starts. Anthony.
I think work experience is the tool that more employers need to embrace, where the employee comes into the workforce for a week, experiences what it's like, and then they can go back to their training. So having businesses that are open and willing to take on students through their training program, I think will determine the success of that business, because they're building potential employees, obviously trying to attract them, but also helping them understand what it's like to become work ready. Yeah,
I always follow the 70-20-10 model of learning of 10% happens in the classroom, 20% through coaching and feedback, and 70% on the job. And I think that's really important, the placements that occur. That 10% is absolutely critical, but I think the idea of doing formal training outside of the workplace and expecting that's going to prepare you perfectly, probably set up to fail. So certainly the apprenticeship and traineeship models are really good, and we had something like 200 student placements at Resthaven in the last 6 months, and that's that bridge between and getting people prepared. You can't be prepared the moment you walk in the door if you haven't walked in the door before.
Rachelle, if there's a new hire joining you from the vet sector, you'd expect them to be ready on day one?
No, I definitely agree. There's not possible to be completely ready on day one, but I think in my experience at TAFE, it was how connected they were to industry to afford volunteering opportunities and interning opportunities while I was studying. So I was already working in the industry and I was already experiencing all of the things, so I felt a lot more comfortable walking in the front door on the first day.
And just before, Shannon, I will mention in Vocational Voices, the podcast that we were recording yesterday with a number of speakers, there is a strong argument for a lot more workplace practice as part of the training process. Shannon?
So, well, did anyone here feel prepared for any job they've ever started on the first day? I don't think it's possible. I think it is managing that expectation by having a close engagement with the employers, with your industry. I think that's all you really can do. You can tell people so much. You can simulate, but the expectations have to be clear between the employers. And if the employers over-expect, then that's not going to go well. But that comes from that relationship.
All right, we'll close it there. I will just say that I have assessed you all with very high competency in being audience members. Thank you so much for your attention. Also, thank you, Shannon Baldock, Refrigeration and Electrical Lecturer at TAFE SA. Rachelle Boyle, Event Planning Coordinator, Adelaide Convention Centre. Tom Cleghorn, Manager Workforce Development, Resthaven. And Anthony Kittel, CEO, Redarc Electronics. Thank you.